What if the biggest mystery in the Diddy saga was never Diddy himself? For years, people have argued about what really happened to Kim Porter. Officially, the story seemed settled. The reports were released, the headlines moved on, and the entertainment world continued spinning as if nothing had changed. But for many observers, something never felt complete. Questions lingered, rumors refused to disappear, and every time new information surfaced about Sean Diddy Combs, those old questions came rushing back into the spotlight. Now, one of the most outspoken voices in entertainment has reignited the conversation in a way nobody expected. Katt Williams has built a reputation for saying what others refuse to say. Whether people agree with him or not, one thing is undeniable. When he speaks, millions listen. And recently, comments connected to Katt Williams have fueled a growing debate about a figure who rarely becomes the center of public discussion. Not Diddy, his mother, because according to years of speculation, public statements, interviews, and ongoing online discussions, some people believe the real story may be far bigger than anyone imagined. They point to unanswered questions, unusual connections, and a series of events that continue to spark controversy long after they happened. Was Kim Porter's death really as straightforward as many were led to believe? Why do certain names keep appearing whenever people revisit this story? And why are so many former insiders, commentators, and industry figures suddenly finding themselves part of the same conversation? Tonight, we're taking a closer look at the claims, the theories, the public statements, and the questions that continue to divide opinions across the internet. Because whether you believe these suspicions or dismiss them completely, one thing is impossible to ignore. The conversation surrounding Kim Porter never truly ended, and what Katt Williams has now brought back into the spotlight may be the most controversial chapter yet. When Kim Porter passed away, the shockwaves extended far beyond celebrity headlines. To the public, she wasn't just another familiar face connected to the entertainment industry. She was someone who had spent years in the spotlight, while somehow managing to maintain a level of dignity and privacy that many celebrities never achieve. She was known as a model, actress, mother, and one of the most important people in Sean Diddy Combs' life. For years, people watched their relationship evolve through different chapters. Sometimes they appeared inseparable, other times they seemed to move in completely different directions. Yet despite the ups and downs, they remained connected through family, shared history, and a bond that many believed could never truly be broken. That is why the news of Kim Porter's death hit so hard. Almost immediately, tributes began pouring in from celebrities, friends, and fans around the world. Social media became flooded with messages describing her kindness, her warmth, and her devotion to her children. The entertainment industry appeared united in grief. At first, it seemed like the story would follow a familiar pattern. A tragic loss would be mourned, memories would be shared, and eventually the public would move on. But that didn't happen. Instead, something unusual occurred. The questions never disappeared. Official reports provided an explanation regarding Kim Porter's passing, and from a legal standpoint, the matter appeared settled. Yet across social media, blogs, discussion forums, and celebrity commentary channels, people continued revisiting the story year after year. Some questioned the timing, others questioned circumstances surrounding her final days. Many simply felt that there were pieces of the story they didn't fully understand. Whether those concerns were justified or not almost became secondary. What mattered was that the conversation refused to die. As the years passed, every new controversy involving Sean Combs seemed to bring Kim Porter's name back into public discussion. It didn't matter whether the topic involved lawsuits, former associates, business disputes, or explosive interviews. Somehow, the public kept circling back to the same question. Was there more to the story than people knew? The rise of social media only amplified that curiosity. In previous decades, unanswered questions often faded away with time. But the internet operates differently. Every interview is archived, every rumor is preserved, every theory can be revisited and shared with millions of people in a matter of hours. As a result, Kim Porter's story never truly left public consciousness. Then something else happened. Public trust in powerful figures within the entertainment industry began to erode. Scandal after scandal revealed that some stories people once dismissed as impossible were later proven to contain elements of truth. This created a new atmosphere where audiences became increasingly willing to revisit old narratives through a different lens. People started asking harder questions. Questions they may not have asked before. Questions they may have once considered inappropriate. And in that environment, certain voices gained renewed influence. One of those voices was Katt Williams. For years, Katt had developed a reputation as someone willing to challenge powerful people and controversial systems. Whether audiences agreed with him or not, they viewed him as someone unafraid to speak openly. When his interviews began generating millions of views and dominating online conversations, viewers didn't just focus on what he was saying in the present, they started looking backward. They revisited old clips, old statements, old warnings, and as they did, many found themselves connecting those comments to ongoing discussions surrounding Diddy, Kim Porter, and the people closest to them. Suddenly, a story that many assumed belonged firmly in the past was being discussed as if it had happened yesterday. What made this situation even more fascinating was that the renewed interest wasn't being driven solely by conspiracy theorists or gossip channels. Mainstream audiences were paying attention too. People who had never followed celebrity scandals were now curious about a story that refused to disappear. The result was a perfect storm of speculation, unanswered questions, and renewed public attention. And the real reason people started listening more closely had less to do with Kim Porter herself and more to do with what was happening around Sean Combs. Because as new allegations, investigations, and controversies began dominating headlines, many people started wondering whether old stories deserved another look. And that is exactly where Katt Williams enters the picture. Because the growing fascination with his comments wasn't really about comedy. It was about whether he had seen something years ago that the rest of the world is only beginning to question now. Long before federal investigations, lawsuits, and shocking headlines began dominating entertainment news, Katt Williams had already built a reputation as one of the industry's most unpredictable voices. Some people viewed him as a comedian who enjoyed stirring controversy. Others believed he was one of the few entertainers willing to challenge powerful figures publicly. Regardless of where people stood, there was one thing almost everyone agreed on. Katt Williams rarely cared about following the crowd. That reputation became even stronger after several interviews went viral across social media. Millions of viewers watched as he spoke about fame, power, influence, and what he believed were hidden realities inside the entertainment business. His comments sparked endless debate. Supporters claimed he was exposing uncomfortable truths. Critics argued he was simply offering opinions that lacked evidence. Yet the more people discussed him, the more attention he received. What made Katt different from many commentators was his ability to plant questions in the minds of viewers. He often avoided presenting himself as someone delivering official answers. Instead, he encouraged audiences to look at situations from a different perspective. He would point to patterns, contradictions, or events that he believed deserved closer examination. As public interest surrounding Sean Combs continued growing, viewers naturally began revisiting many of Katt's older statements. Suddenly, comments that once seemed controversial were being analyzed frame by frame across podcasts, reaction channels, and social media platforms. People searched through interviews looking for clues. They debated whether certain remarks had been misunderstood. Others wondered if Katt had been hinting at something much larger than anyone realized at the time. This created a fascinating shift in public perception. Years earlier, many audiences might have dismissed celebrity commentary as entertainment, but the environment had changed dramatically. High-profile scandals across multiple industries had taught people that powerful public figures were not immune from scrutiny. Stories that once sounded impossible were now being re-examined with fresh eyes. As a result, viewers became more willing to revisit old conversations. And that is exactly what happened with Katt Williams. His words started carrying a different weight. Not because new evidence had suddenly appeared, but because the broader context had changed. Audiences were no longer looking at his statements in isolation. They were comparing them against an entirely new landscape of allegations, investigations, and public controversies. The internet amplified this process even further. Every time a new headline emerged involving Sean Combs, clips of Katt Williams immediately resurfaced. Comment sections filled with people claiming he had predicted certain developments. Others argued that he was simply benefiting from hindsight. Either way, the result was the same. More people were listening. What makes this story especially interesting is that much of the discussion eventually moved beyond Diddy himself. At first, public attention focused almost entirely on the music mogul. That was expected. He was the famous figure at the center of countless headlines. But over time, another question began emerging. Who were the people surrounding him throughout the rise of his empire? Who influenced him during his earliest years? Who remained close to him as his business interests expanded? And who may have played significant roles behind the scenes while remaining largely invisible to the public? These questions pushed online discussions into new territory. Instead of focusing exclusively on one individual, people started examining relationships, family connections, and long-standing associations. They looked at old interviews. They revisited documentaries. They searched for details that might help explain how one of the most powerful figures in entertainment developed his worldview and built his empire. Again, none of this provided definitive answers, but it generated enormous curiosity. And curiosity is often the fuel that drives viral conversations. The more people searched for context, the more frequently one name appeared. A name that had spent decades operating mostly outside the spotlight, a name that many casual observers barely knew. Yet according to critics, commentators, and online theorists, that name may hold important clues to understanding the larger story. Whether those theories are accurate remains a matter of debate. But what cannot be denied is that public attention has shifted, and as audiences continue revisiting the past in search of answers, they are increasingly focusing on someone who was present long before the fame, the fortune, and the controversies. Someone who witnessed the rise of the empire from the very beginning, Janice Combs. And once people started looking more closely at her role in the story, an entirely new set of questions began to emerge. As public attention intensified around Sean Combs, many observers began asking a different question. Instead of focusing solely on the man at the center of the headlines, they started looking at the people who had been closest to him throughout his life. That search inevitably led to one person who had been there from the very beginning: his mother, Janice Combs. For decades, Janice remained largely outside the spotlight. Unlike many celebrity parents who actively pursued media attention, she rarely became the focus of public conversation. Most people knew very little about her beyond the fact that she had raised Sean Combs after the tragic loss of his father at a young age. In many ways, her story appeared straightforward. She was often described as a hard-working mother who faced enormous challenges while raising a child in difficult circumstances. Supporters viewed her as someone who helped provide the foundation that allowed her son to achieve extraordinary success. To them, she represented perseverance, sacrifice, and determination. But as often happens when public figures come under scrutiny, people began revisiting old stories and examining them from entirely new perspectives. Suddenly, details that had received little attention for years were being discussed across social media, podcasts, documentaries, and online forums. Questions emerged. How much influence did Janice have during Sean Combs' formative years? What kind of environment shaped the future music mogul? And how involved was she in the development of the empire that would eventually make her son one of the most powerful figures in entertainment? The answers depended largely on who was telling the story. Some former associates and commentators described a household environment that exposed young Sean to adult situations at an early age. Others argued that these accounts were exaggerated, distorted, or impossible to verify decades later. This divide created one of the most controversial aspects of the conversation. Supporters of various theories pointed to interviews and documentaries that discussed Sean Combs' upbringing. They argued that understanding the environment in which he grew up was essential to understanding the man he later became. Skeptics pushed back. They noted that childhood circumstances alone cannot explain every decision a person makes later in life. Millions of people grow up facing challenges without becoming the subjects of public controversy. Drawing direct lines between early experiences and later actions, they argued, often oversimplifies complex human behavior. Yet the debate continued. Part of the reason was simple. People are naturally fascinated by origin stories. Whenever a powerful figure becomes the center of a major scandal, the public almost always begins searching for answers in the past. They want to understand where everything started. They want to identify the influences, relationships, and experiences that may have shaped the individual they see today. That process was now unfolding around Sean Combs. And because Janice had been present from the very beginning, her role became impossible to ignore. Another factor driving public interest was the perception that she remained connected to important aspects of the family's financial and business affairs. Whether these perceptions were accurate or exaggerated, they fueled ongoing discussions about her influence behind the scenes. Critics began portraying her as far more than a parent. In their view, she was a central figure within a much larger network of relationships and decisions that stretched back decades. Supporters rejected those claims entirely. They argued that many online commentators were taking isolated facts and building elaborate narratives around them. They believed Janice was being unfairly targeted simply because of her connection to a famous and controversial son. The truth, as is often the case, became increasingly difficult to separate from speculation. Every new documentary seemed to generate additional questions. Every resurfaced interview created fresh debate. Every social media discussion introduced new theories. And because so much of the conversation relied on interpretation rather than confirmed evidence, people often reached dramatically different conclusions while examining the same information. Still, one reality remained impossible to ignore. The more attention Sean Combs received, the more attention shifted toward the people closest to him. Among those individuals, no one attracted more curiosity than Janice Combs. She represented a connection to the earliest chapters of the story, a witness to the rise of an empire, a figure who had remained largely in the background while her son became a global celebrity. For some observers, that made her an important source of context. For others, it made her a target of unfair speculation. But regardless of where people stood, interest in her role continued growing. And as those questions expanded beyond personal history and family dynamics, they began moving into an area that often reveals more than words ever can: money. Because, while stories can be debated and memories can be disputed, financial relationships often leave trails behind. And according to many critics, that trail may be one of the most important pieces of the larger puzzle. If there is one lesson that history has taught us about major scandals, it is that money often tells a story that public statements never can. People can deny allegations, witnesses can disagree, memories can fade, but financial records have a way of creating timelines that are much harder to ignore. That is why, as public attention surrounding Sean Combs continued to grow, many observers began shifting their focus away from personalities and toward finances. They wanted to know how the empire operated behind the scenes. They wanted to understand who controlled what, who benefited from certain arrangements, and how power was distributed among the people closest to the organization. For years, critics of Sean Combs have argued that money sits at the center of nearly every controversy associated with his career. Former artists have publicly complained about contracts. Others have questioned ownership rights. Some have accused the business structure of benefiting a small group of insiders while leaving performers with far less than they believed they had earned. Whether those criticisms are entirely fair remains a matter of debate. But what is undeniable is that financial disputes have followed Sean Combs throughout much of his professional life. And that reality has led many people to ask a simple question: if money played such an important role in building the empire, who was helping manage and protect that empire behind the scenes? That question has become even more significant as reports of family tensions and financial disagreements have attracted increasing public attention. Whenever large fortunes are involved, relationships can change quickly. Families that appear united from the outside can suddenly find themselves locked in bitter disputes. Long-standing loyalties can be tested. Private disagreements can become public battles. And when hundreds of millions of dollars are potentially at stake, every decision begins attracting scrutiny. Many commentators believe that financial records could eventually reveal more about the inner workings of the organization than years of interviews ever could. Not because money automatically proves wrongdoing, but because financial relationships often expose who held influence, who exercised control, and who occupied positions of trust. This is one reason why comments made by former bad boy artist Mace continue attracting attention years after they were first delivered. Mace has repeatedly criticized Sean Combs over business matters, publishing rights, and artist compensation. His public statements sparked major conversations because they came from someone who had experienced the system firsthand. Supporters viewed him as an insider, exposing uncomfortable realities. Critics argued that personal grievances may have influenced his perspective. Regardless of where people stood, his comments helped fuel broader discussions about transparency, ownership, and accountability within the music industry. Those discussions became even more relevant as public interest surrounding Sean Combs intensified. People began revisiting old interviews, old disputes, old accusations, and they started asking whether financial arrangements from the past could provide important context for events unfolding in the present. What makes financial questions especially compelling is that they often move beyond emotion. Unlike rumors or personal opinions, money creates documentation. Transactions leave records. Assets leave paper trails. Ownership structures can be examined. This is why investigators, journalists, and legal teams frequently focus on financial evidence when attempting to understand how powerful organizations function. The public understands this instinctively. That is why so many online discussions eventually return to the same topic: follow the money. Not because money always reveals criminal behavior, but because it often reveals relationships, and relationships are at the heart of every major story. As more people examined the financial side of Sean Combs' empire, they became increasingly interested in the individuals who may have played important roles behind the scenes. Questions about influence, control, and decision-making became just as important as questions about public appearances or personal relationships. Yet despite all the speculation, clear answers remained frustratingly difficult to find. Some observers saw financial complexity, where others saw normal business operations. Some interpreted certain arrangements as suspicious. Others viewed them as entirely ordinary for someone managing a massive entertainment empire. The divide between those perspectives only fueled further debate, and that debate eventually expanded into an even darker area of discussion. Because while money can explain power, it cannot explain why certain stories continue haunting the public imagination year after year. For many people, the most unsettling questions were no longer about contracts, assets, or ownership. They were about patterns. Patterns that some believe are meaningful. Patterns that others dismiss as coincidence. Patterns involving several figures connected to the same world, the same era, and the same circle of influence. And whether those connections are real or imagined, they have become impossible for many observers to ignore. Because once people started looking beyond the financial questions, they found themselves confronting something far more controversial, a pattern that continues fueling debate across the internet to this very day. At the center of nearly every major controversy, there comes a moment when facts and emotions begin to collide. That moment usually arrives when people stop focusing on individual events and start looking for patterns. Whether those patterns are real or imagined often becomes the subject of intense debate. Some people see connections everywhere. Others believe human beings are naturally wired to find meaning in unrelated events. But once a pattern enters public consciousness, it can be incredibly difficult to erase, and that is exactly what has happened in discussions surrounding Sean Combs, Kim Porter, and several other figures connected to the music industry. For years, online communities have pointed to a series of tragedies involving individuals who occupied important positions within the same entertainment circles. Every time a new controversy emerges, those names resurface. People revisit old headlines, old interviews, old memories, and they begin asking the same question all over again. Is this all coincidence? Or is there something more that the public still doesn't understand? Supporters of various theories often point to the deaths of influential figures connected to the early days of hip-hop and the music business. They argue that too many unusual events have occurred around the same network of people to simply ignore. Skeptics strongly disagree. They point out that the entertainment industry is massive, stressful, and highly visible. Over time, Any large group of public figures will inevitably experience tragedies, health crises, personal struggles, and untimely deaths. Human beings naturally remember the events that fit a narrative, while overlooking countless examples that do not. This disagreement has created one of the most divisive conversations surrounding the entire story. On one side are people who believe certain connections deserve deeper examination. On the other side are those who believe speculation often transforms ordinary coincidences into elaborate conspiracies. Neither side appears willing to back down, and that is why the conversation continues growing. Perhaps no figure has contributed more to that debate than Al B. Sure. For years, Al B. Sure has publicly expressed concerns regarding Kim Porter's death. His comments have attracted significant attention because of his personal connection to Kim and the family. Unlike internet commentators discussing events from a distance, he knew the people involved personally. That fact alone causes many observers to take his statements seriously. At the same time, critics caution against assuming that personal beliefs automatically constitute evidence. They argue that grief, unanswered questions, and emotional connections can sometimes shape perceptions in powerful ways. Yet regardless of how people interpret his comments, one thing is clear. His willingness to speak publicly ensured that the discussion never completely disappeared. Every interview generated new headlines. Every statement fueled additional debate. Every appearance introduced the story to a new audience. As years passed, his concerns became part of a larger narrative that extended far beyond any single individual. The internet amplified everything. Discussion forums filled with theories. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to examining old claims. Reaction channels dissected interviews line by line. Social media users shared clips, screenshots, and timelines in an effort to connect events spanning decades. The result was a cycle that fed itself. The more people discussed the theories, the more visible they became. The more visible they became, the more people joined the conversation. And the conversation eventually reached a point where many observers found themselves asking a deeper question. Why are so many people struggling to accept the official explanations? The answer may have less to do with evidence and more to do with trust. In recent years, public confidence in powerful institutions has declined dramatically. Many people have witnessed scandals that exposed misconduct hidden for years behind wealth, influence, and reputation. As a result, audiences have become more skeptical. They question official narratives more frequently. They revisit old stories more aggressively, and they are far more willing to consider possibilities that previous generations might have dismissed outright. This changing mindset helps explain why discussions surrounding Kim Porter continue attracting attention long after her passing. The debate is no longer only about one person. It has become part of a much larger conversation about power, accountability, and transparency. Because for many observers, the most important issue is not whether every theory is true. The most important issue is why so many people feel unsatisfied with the answers they have received. And that lingering sense of uncertainty may be the reason this story refuses to fade away. Because when questions remain unresolved in the minds of millions, they often become more powerful than answers themselves. And in the case of Kim Porter, those questions may be louder today than they have ever been. After years of speculation, controversy, interviews, documentaries, and endless online debates, the story surrounding Kim Porter remains one of the most discussed mysteries in celebrity culture. What makes it so fascinating is not simply the questions themselves, it is the fact that people continue asking them. Most celebrity stories follow a predictable cycle. A major event captures public attention. Headlines dominate for a few weeks. Opinions are shared. Eventually, a new story arrives and everyone moves on. That never happened here. Instead, Kim Porter's name continued resurfacing year after year. Every new development involving Janice Combs seemed to pull the story back into public conversation. Every interview sparked fresh debate. Every documentary introduced a new audience to questions that had never completely disappeared. And that is where Katt Williams enters the picture once again. Whether people agree with him or disagree with him, Katt has become a symbol of skepticism toward powerful institutions and influential figures. His comments resonate because they reflect something many people already feel: doubt, not certainty. not proof, doubt. The distinction matters. One of the biggest mistakes people make during high-profile controversies is confusing suspicion with evidence. The two are not the same thing. A question is not proof. A theory is not proof. A rumor is not proof. And yet questions often serve an important purpose. They encourage investigation. They encourage scrutiny. They encourage people to look more closely at information that might otherwise be ignored. That is why stories like this continue attracting attention long after official conclusions have been reached. For many people, the issue is not whether every allegation is true. The issue is whether every question has been adequately answered. And in the minds of countless observers, the answer to that question remains no. Over the years, Kim Porter's story has evolved into something larger than a discussion about one person. It has become a reflection of how modern audiences process information in an age of constant media exposure. People no longer consume news passively. They investigate, they compare sources, they search for old interviews, they analyze public statements, they build timelines, they challenge narratives. Sometimes that process uncovers important truths. Other times it creates confusion. But either way, it changes the relationship between public figures and the people who follow them. Sean Combs now finds himself at the center of a storm unlike anything he has faced before. Legal battles, public scrutiny, and intense media coverage have transformed the way many people view his legacy. As that transformation continues, older stories are being re-evaluated through an entirely different lens. Events that once appeared settled are being questioned again. Relationships that once seemed straightforward are being examined more closely. And figures who previously remained in the background are now receiving unprecedented attention. That includes Janice Combs. For decades, she occupied a position largely outside public scrutiny. Now, discussions about her role, her influence, and her connection to various aspects of the larger story have become impossible to avoid. Whether those discussions ultimately lead anywhere remains unknown. What is certain is that public curiosity continues growing. And curiosity has a remarkable ability to keep stories alive. The internet has ensured that nothing truly disappears anymore. Old interviews can be rediscovered in seconds. Forgotten headlines can reappear overnight. Comments made years ago can suddenly become relevant again. That reality guarantees that conversations surrounding Kim Porter will likely continue for years to come. Some people believe the official record tells the complete story. Others remain convinced that important pieces are still missing. Between those positions lies a vast space, filled with uncertainty, speculation, and unanswered questions. Perhaps future information will provide greater clarity. Perhaps it will not. Perhaps some questions will never receive definitive answers. History is filled with mysteries that continue generating debate long after the people involved are gone. What makes this case different is the emotional weight attached to it. Kim Porter was not merely a headline, she was a mother, a friend, a public figure whose life touched many people. That is one reason the conversation refuses to fade. The questions are connected to a real person whose absence is still felt by those who knew and loved her. As for Katt Williams, his role in this story may be less about revealing new information and more about reigniting old conversations. He has reminded audiences of something powerful. People rarely stop searching for answers when they feel something remains unresolved. Whether those feelings are justified or not, they shape public perception. And public perception often influences the stories society chooses to revisit. Maybe the official explanation is exactly what happened. Maybe there are details the public still does not know. Maybe the truth exists somewhere between certainty and speculation. At this point, nobody can say with complete confidence. But one thing is beyond dispute. Years after Kim Porter passed away, millions of people are still talking about her. They are still debating, still questioning, still searching. And as long as those questions continue echoing across interviews, documentaries, podcasts, and social media, this story will remain alive. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are not the ones built on answers. They are the ones built on uncertainty, the ones that leave people wondering, the ones that refuse to be forgotten. And right now, few stories in the entertainment world carry more unanswered questions than the story of Kim Porter, Sean Combs, and the conversations that Katt Williams has once again pushed back into the spotlight.